Hello, this is James, welcome back. We're now on the cusp of CTL Season 13, and I have a range of topics to discuss pertaining to both the just finished season as well as some precursory thoughts about next season. Last video sucked according to a few people, but that's fine because I just wanted to get that topic out of my system before I got back to more focused topics. In episode 2, I got done talking about CTL Season 11 and how it was a departure from previous seasons with respect to both the mentality that was taken towards the way the league was approached by the staff, as well as the derivative influence it had on the mentality of the general player base as a result of the council's new approach. But CTL Season 12 proved to be much more of a mixed bag in that regard. It can be referred to in some ways as having continued upon that trend of major staff decisions being made out of the community's hands for the sake of improving the league without having to be hampered down by democratic proceedings. Of course, I'm namely referring to the GSC Demerge here, but concerning how the game is played itself, it has been much more of the same. So much so, in fact, that some people have even gone as far as to say that it was a barely different repeat of last season, a filler season, if you will, that existed in between the new format introduced in Season 11 and the upcoming Season 13, which removed all tracks. Not actually all tracks, go watch episode 2, it's my best one thus far, from the potential vote options. Next episode will be exclusively about the format vote for the season, assuming that I can pull out enough from the subject to expand it into a discrete video, because I do want to discuss the potential that was inherent to the non-all tracks options, and why I actually agree with the staff's decision to remove the option to vote for all tracks this time around, some of my underlying reasoning behind which I'll get into in this video. And so, Season 12 can be ideologically placed at the end of its own intermediary 3-season-long era that encompassed 2024 in between what will presumably be another upcoming track pick restriction era, that is to say anything but no rematch repicks or all tracks, and the no rematch repick seasons that we've played throughout the past year. The general points of grievance in Season 12 apparently seem to be with the extremely similar composition and predicted seedings of the top two divisions when comparing Seasons 11 and 12, the decrease in signups, which thereby heralded the existence of multiple 5-team divs, and the repeat track format. But before I can get into any of that, I have to give some background to frame the season itself in the broader context of MKW, because there was an important change behind the scenes in the way that CTL and GSC contend their collective arrangement as the two biggest competitive leagues in MKW. Prior to Season 12, and for quite a while prior, CTL and GSC had been merged. Over the course of Season 11, though, CTL staff were presumably becoming very fed up with the lack of respect that was given to our side of the game from GSC staff. This underlying tension had been extant for quite some time as a result of the lack of Discord permissions that were inherently allotted to the CT staff and the GSC server itself, as a byproduct of the simple limitation of attempting to coordinate too much at once within a single actual Discord server. But this otherwise discrete and potentially solvable problem was further exacerbated by a general attitude of unwillingness to cooperate, as well as a plain and simple error of bureaucracy to the entire conception of GSC staff itself, which is an issue that has been raised many times in recent years, whether it be the generally nepotistic and seat-warming do-nothing behavior, or outright attempts to coordinate targeted punitive campaigns against people like Frozen, which was actually a case in which both of those things were made apparent simultaneously. Furthermore, the entire purpose of the merge itself was ostensibly supposed to be that it would have been facilitative of the entire MKW community partnering with MK Central, which is the website that the AD players moved over to once the formerly all Mario Kart centralizing MK boards died. Since the MKW community hasn't gotten a single update on that in over 2 years at the time, holding out that something would serendipitously occur to finalize the, for all intents and purposes, failed partnership wasn't a legitimate concern for anybody. Of course, halfway through Season 12, more information was finally announced, stating that the MK Central partnership would, in fact, actually come to fruition in the near future. But the cat's pretty much already out of the bag. The MKW MK Central dumpster fire could probably be the subject of its own video, and it'll certainly be the focal point of something that I have in mind for the future, but its relevancy to this video ends there. And what do you know, perfect timing, because it's once again time for James U.S. Conspiracy Theory Hour. Although this one is more of a mini theory, and it's quite superficial, but I think you'll love how far-fetched it is. Despite the issues between GSC and CTL staff that arose from their diametric operation in the same server, potential opportunities that may have existed to lift both ships probably weren't actually being completely ignored by the GSC higher-ups. With a quasi-educated level of awareness of both leagues, I came to a conclusion which might just potentially line up. Back in August, both CTL Season 11 and GSC Season 9 were wrapping things up around the same time. As a result of this fortuitous timing of both leagues finishing within the same time frame, I theorized that GSC staff tried to sort of throw a bone to the CTL team by introducing an RT team tournament onto the MKW league itinerary. As opposed to having each track type start their season simultaneously, which would have resulted in people who play both track types having to play up to 4 matches a week at some points, the GSC staff had this idea for a tournament, which would eventually become what you know today as the MKW Majors. That would simultaneously allow them to do something different to a conventional season on RTs, while also staggering the schedule away from the CT season. The reason why the latter point might have been seen as particularly beneficial is because it would have made the workload between the RT and CT GSC staff more distinct for at least a little while, seeing as CT GSC Season 12 could have undergone the process of staff setting up the season on their own without having to also contend with the RT season starting at the same time. Especially since the CT staff having their workload-related needs unaddressed was a big point of concern for them. Now, while I fundamentally disagree with the idea that there's something wrong with just hosting conventional seasons repeatedly, despite the fact that I do recognize the idea that it's supposed to break the alleged monotony that naturally arises over time, there's nothing to say that consecutive seasons will make people wash out of playing the league at a faster rate than they would otherwise. Hence, the reason why I think that spicing up the RT side might not have been the only motivation behind the Majors tourney's existence. But then, fed up with the GSC team in general, the CT staff decided to demerge the leagues anyways, leaving them holding the ball on a fully planned out tournament. However, even if I am correct about all of this, the tournament still went smoothly enough from an actual organizational perspective. Some RT players were naturally mad that their season had been delayed so long for the Majors, especially considering the format, but I'll get back to that in just a second. The fact that, according to JC, the schedule for CTL Season 13 isn't currently slated to overlap at all with GSC Season 11 actually means that regardless of whether or not the Majors tourney was intended to make the seasonal time frames of each track type more discrete or not, the downstream effects of the buffer that it placed upon the MKW league itinerary as a whole are actually working out pretty beneficially a little while onwards. So that's the theory. Was it pretty underwhelming? Yeah, it was, but that begs the question as to why it was worth bringing up in the first place. And while that theory was just for fun, this does still connect to the topic that I interrupted it for, that being my defense of the choice to demerge. The adjacent subject of GSC itself, and the way in which the Majors tourney itself was conducted, despite having no in-game relation to CTs since it took place on RTs, is actually perfectly conducive to an argument against keeping the leagues merged. Like I just said, the interruption of the RT GSC schedule wasn't the only reason why RT players didn't like the Majors. To illustrate the point I'm going to try to make, I'll take a brief detour into discussing the ideology behind the GSC server's creation in 2021. After the 2-year waste of time that was MKPS, The MKW community wanted nothing more than to return to the divisional format that had worked for so long leading up to MKPS's creation. But more importantly than that, they had also learned something about what progress should look like in the competitive community. Creating esoteric, sub-tourney formats and overly ambitious year-long mega brackets that eliminated the vast majority of teams far before the end was even in sight is the exact opposite of what progress in MKW looks like. And yet, it's exactly what the entirety of 2020 and 2021 looked like for RT players. These transgressive formats are what the GSC server was made specifically to escape from. And although the Majors tourney did attempt to maintain a tangential connection to GSC's usual format during the pool stage, which consisted of 4-team, 6-match mini-divs to determine the seedings for the second stage, the second stage ultimately exposed the pool stage as being the closest thing to a complete waste of time that it could have been. The second stage comprised exclusively single elimination matches that actively punished the teams that had done well in the preceding stage by putting them in harder matchups. I can't imagine how many teams got knocked out in their first best of 3 in the second stage and immediately realized that their efforts to perform well in the preceding stage had been a wasted effort. All the while, GSC keeps failing on its fundamental fronts while simultaneously trying to introduce new shit every season. This season, the new development being pushed is back-to-back matches against the same team, which was, ironically enough, brought over from the Majors because it's seen as easier than trying to schedule 2 matches at different times. I would give my opinion, but it doesn't actually matter since I don't care about RTs. I'm just providing that example so I can juxtapose it with one of how they've lost ground on infrastructure that previously existed, that being the media team. In CT Seasons 10 and 11, I was consistently pleasantly surprised by some interesting casts, despite their overall infrequency. We got a variety of casting duos and groups from different clans who all brought something entertaining to the table. Meanwhile, on the RT side, things have been far less active. It seems as if the only matches that have even the faintest chance of being casted on RTs are high div, playoff, determinant main season matches, or outright playoff matches. And even then, there's no guarantee that you won't be presented with the evergreen duo of Vinny and Zexus. Even years and years ago in the mid to late 2010s, there was a solid roster of casters on the MK Boards team who were all sectioned off into their own range of divs, with the highest status casters being relegated to higher divs, with less experienced and lower ranking casters still having the opportunity to cast matches, including random, relatively inconsequential low div main season matches that would typically be overlooked. There is a place, though, where I have seen a similar phenomenon, and that was CTL Season 12. A ubiquitous topic of discussion just prior to the Demerge in the CT public chat was this very issue. I know that OJ and JC were spearheading a lot of this, so credits to them for making the CTL YouTube channel and setting up simulcasted streams on YouTube as well. Which is also doubly beneficial because it means that matches will be archived by default on YouTube, as opposed to someone like me having to take the time to collect them on something like my second channel. The entire stream team for CTs was very dedicated in Season 12, and it really showed. All the playoff finals matches were casted to the channel, and almost all of the semis, with a range of casters from different respective skill levels, some of them casting for the first time now that they've gotten the chance to. All of the work that they've done is worth discussing in its own right, but this also brings me to my next point, which will be more of a refutation. The primary argument against demerging that I witnessed came from people who believed that the split into a separate server would result in less activity. The idea behind this is that being an inseparable part of the GSC server, even if the CT staff themselves were overlooked and struggled with their own autonomy, would result in both more credibility being offered to CTs by the mere adjacency to RTs, as well as more activity as a result of additional exposure, which would thereby introduce people to CTs who may not have otherwise found out that they're played competitively. Starting off with the latter point, I disagree on that front because being in the GSC server itself already implies a level of awareness of the entirety of the competitive community. And even if that were to not be the case, for example, if you were to imagine someone whose exposure to MKW is exclusively through Frozen's channel, that hypothetical person would still have a very high likelihood of discovering the existence of CTL as a result of either finding one of Frozen's other videos featuring CTs, or stumbling upon a match on one of his streams whenever he plays for 6C. As for the credibility of CTs, I don't think that CT players are particularly concerned with credibility, considering that you already accept a sort of existential risk by playing CTs themselves, wherein you may encounter bad tracks, bugs, bad updates that remove combo-oriented tracks, and so on. RT players in the GSC server that were exposed to announcements regarding the CT side either didn't care at all, or actively criticized the server staff for cluttering the announcements chat with information that they weren't interested in. Something else I noticed that oftentimes occurred during the merge era that I disliked was when the ideas of RT players and their culture would seep into discussion about CTs. There's a message I saw a while ago that sticks out to me as emblematic of this, but I can't exactly find it, so I'll paraphrase. It was from Macy, who I think is a staff member in the server or something, but it doesn't really matter, who simply asked, why don't CT players just have 5-week seasons like we do? First of all, CTs did try 5-week seasons, and it failed miserably. The reason behind why, and the fact that it would seem so incomprehensible when explained to an RT player, speaks to the divide that exists between the two respective communities for each track type. The simplest answer that I can give is that CT players are used to playing the game less, and playing the game for the proportional amount of time that CT players do is part of their ingrained culture that has developed over the years. Because this is technically just a mod, it's less popular, which thereby creates a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein a community with less activity develops a heuristic of desiring to play in moderate amounts over a longer period of time, as opposed to playing much more actively over short periods of time, i.e. the blitzkrieg, fast-paced seasons on RTs, which felt very foreign when it was forced upon CT players. This, however, isn't the kind of thing that makes inherent sense to an RT player. They would logically assume that if all of the RT players with full-time jobs and packed schedules can handle 2 matches a week, then the same would be true for CT players for whom the same conditions apply, but that's not the case. I think the fact that such a distinction exists is a perfect microcosm for why CTL taking place in its own server is generally beneficial, because we can exist within our own cultural bubble that doesn't have to contend with people who can't fundamentally understand idiosyncrasies like this. I think now, returning to this idea that people will have a small chance of being proselytized as a byproduct of hosting CTs out of the same server, it'll make more sense why I don't think it holds up. In the event that an argument like this were to be correct, we wouldn't be seeing any RT players take interest in CTL, because by the nature of the argument they wouldn't have any reason to be interested. However, the signups for Season 13 paint a much different story. AV signed up, to everyone's surprise, JC is playing, LV returned to play, and even WZ would have played again if not for Flow having already taken too many of their players. All of these teams are RT-oriented, and were all not only fully aware of the league taking place, but also went through the process of gathering a team and registering. I still ultimately don't want to downplay the concerns that people had about demerging, but I just don't think that most of them have come to pass. Though, with that being said, the anti-demerge crowd did have a slam dunk argument going into Season 12, which was the lack of signups. It's no secret that 5-team divs are terrible. It's also no secret that there were 4 of them out of the 5 divs last season, the only exception to this being D2, which has its own large category of teams to pull from such that staff never have to resort to the 5-team solution. According to the council, there was initially a much more balanced arrangement, but the equilibrium was broken when a new bottom div team signed up out of nowhere at the last second. I suppose that can be chalked up as unfortunate. I really have nothing to say about that because the only alternative would be not to seed them at all, which of course nobody wants to do since these people could plausibly become the future of the league. D1, though, is of course the div that it hurts the most to have to write off as the designated 5-teamer. It happened in seasons 9 and 11 as well, and it looks like it's happening yet again for the third time in a row in season 13. If there's one thing that best represents the kind of tangible in-league structure that comes with what I like to call meta stagnation, it's this. D1 has had a huge problem finding a team that can fill that final slot up skill-wise, much less a team that is also eager to take on 6C, despite the awareness of how impossibly the odds would be stacked against that theoretical team. Meanwhile, in D2, a smattering of the same collection of teams returns every season for years on end like it's the bowling alley every Saturday evening. In both instances, of course, the results are completely predictable. 6C wins D1, Triton loses D2. Patterns continue to etch themselves into reality as if they were predetermined from the start. This is the practical downstream consequence of meta stagnation. Just about everyone thought that the same trends would continue going into playoff finals, especially since we lost semis like always, this time to SV, but I think we may have just witnessed the Overton window shift with these results. SV came back from losing match 1 against MI to win finals 2-1. In D1, JZ, which was kind of an offshoot of PRS for those unaware, also came back from a match 1 loss, as well as a large deficit in match 2, to also win 2-1. And just like that, both of the predicted results were shattered. And all of a sudden I feel as if there's a glimmer of hope that the results could continue to be shaken up in the future. Regardless of whether D1 finals were a shock diff, and regardless of whether D2 finals were a throw, they both were, the change in attitudes, if it can be claimed to exist, and if it will be felt going into the first season that isn't all tracks in over a year, is one that does not include continued stagnation as a foregone conclusion. One thing that does seem to be a foregone conclusion, though, is that 6C is even more strongly predicted to win next season than they would be in any other given season, because there isn't any PRS-esque group registered. They've all split off into various other groups, which in turn means that all of the players with the best chance to stop them from uncontestedly winning have, in lieu of the previous set of circumstances with both low and mid D1 teams, created an array of exclusively mid D1 teams without any high D1 teams except for 6C themselves, thereby making the competition between themselves more interesting while seemingly consigning themselves to a loss in the end. With that in mind, I wanted to dedicate this next segment to a short topic that I can't fit in anywhere else. It's something I actually formed most of my thoughts on mid-livestream viewing of the opponent's perspectives for some of 6C's main season matches over the course of Season 12, as well as the recent playoff finals. This is how to beat 6C from a conceptual, keyword conceptual, standpoint. That is to say that as little as possible of this will consist of actual on-the-racetrack tips and tricks, since I'm not at the prerequisite level of skill to be able to offer any of those. You see, over the course of the past 2 seasons, something has happened that I haven't ever otherwise seen take place, at least in earnest. Of course, it's played as a joke, but there are people who earnestly agree. They've called for the CTL staff to forcibly intervene against Zilla's strategy of acquiring as many tippity top of D1 players as possible to play on 6E with him. I don't really have anything to say about this subject from an actual intellectual video essayist YouTuber standpoint. It's just what it is. And I'm thankful that this is the subject that I blank out upon, because it will never happen anyways. I'm only bringing it up because it illustrates how the D1 player base collectively feels about their relation to 6C. No team believes that it is realistically possible to legitimately beat them. Even JZs themselves last season were only able to motivate themselves to play their main season matches versus them by prematurely resigning themselves to losing, despite the fact they managed to win one of them. Here's the thing. An underdog mentality is very tricky to get right. You have to balance logical understanding of the disadvantage that you face with an underlying motivation and a belief that it is still possible to win. Instead of trying to verbalize this further metaphorically, I'll do it alongside an explanation of my own experience. In Lounge, Zilla always cans as host so he can start in first race 1 of every GP. I also do this. I'm hosting in this background footage. When Zilla is playing, most people, even those who would otherwise host, oftentimes neglect to even bother canning as host so as to put their hat in the ring to try to win host RNG against him, because he will very oftentimes join second and force you out at the beginning of the race on all of your first place starts. It's already happened to me multiple times. And I imagine that he's probably laughing at me every time in call as my efforts prove futile. But regardless, I make the attempt to compete to stay in first at the start of my host races. Not canning as host is essentially the equivalent of what most D1 teams have been doing. Not giving up per se, and certainly not inting, but still not going into the match with the mentality that everything that can be done to beat 6E should be done and must be done. When they get their track picks, it's no big deal because they're going to win anyways. When they get top 3, it's okay that there was something you could have done better in the race because you were 1v3ing them in top spots anyways, and getting hit out is inevitable against the best players. If you want to have a chance at beating them, don't give any premature credence to the idea that you're going to lose, whether that's before the match or early on in it. To continue with this idea, let's go back to halfway through match 2 of D1 playoff finals, when Jay-Z was down by a sizable amount. The casters on the stream thought it was over, the chat thought it was over, but evidently Jay-Z's players themselves didn't. They top 4 to bring it back into winnable territory and managed to clinch out the match. But what makes 6E so special anyways? I mean, is there any stratagem that a mid D1 team could take advantage of that they somehow can't? Like I said, I'm keeping this purely theoretical. When mid D1 teams face each other, they're getting something that 6E hasn't gotten in the running department for many seasons, an intense and close match, both on paper and in practicality. These matchups have the greatest conductivity to improvement out of any CT wars played across the entire scope of MKW. 6E may be leagues above any other team skill-wise, but as a result, they lose the inherent potential to improve as fast as the other teams. Of course, all of their players are going to continue to improve on their own through other means, otherwise they wouldn't have had the longevity that they do. But if you accept it to be the case that the D1 teams that are close in skill to each other have the potential to improve faster than 6C, then by definition, eventually those teams will all catch up. In the same vein as that previous assertion, you can furthermore potentially argue that 6C is also naturally going to have a harder time playing a match while down than other teams, because their default methodology is to preserve a lead after building one initially on their best tracks. When they're down, they will be out of their element, simply because it isn't typically a necessity for them to have to try to recover from a deficit. People like Zilla and Frozen, of course, like to play risky because it's what they're good at, but they aren't being pressured into playing that way by a point deficit. That isn't a particularly well thought through example, but it doesn't matter all too much because good luck at getting them down for the majority of any given war anyways. This might then naturally lead you to instead think the other way, while keeping the same concept in mind. Perhaps you can beat 6C by capitalizing upon some inherent overconfidence that they've developed by winning so frequently. And in response to that, I would disagree with the phrasing of such a sentiment, but I actually do agree with the underlying sentiment itself. In just the same way that they're only capable of improving to a limited extent, the natural state of a 6C war being one of all but guaranteed success ensures that a pervasive attitude of what could perhaps be called overconfidence, but really deserves to be thought of as an inherent self-assured state of superiority is going to arise. And when that state of equilibrium is broken, of course things are liable to go wrong. Now, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this really is all conceptual. None of this is meant to state that Frozen or Zilla or Brody are doing anything wrong, that they could have somehow otherwise avoided. If I'm to be believed about any of this, then all of these phenomena would occur to any team that is both extremely dominant and extremely successful over a long period of time. The way I see it is that if you're used to winning, then your natural inclination will be to keep on playing how you previously did, instead of attempting to go out of your way to adjust your strategies, because your existing strategies already result in positive outcomes. The more you win, the more you will be inclined to stick with what you've stuck with previously. Of course, a D1 winning team will be at the forefront of new strategies, but there will never be an inherent reason to do something like a hardcore VOD review, or on the CT side, for instance, looking for new track picks. Keep in mind why I'm emphasizing the aspect of inherentness when it comes to these things, because 6E does actively make efforts to continue to improve. You can reach this conclusion simply by listening to their calls after the races. I've noticed this with JX as well. After the race, even if it was a winning race, no matter what, they'll discuss how their gameplay could have been optimized, as well as what would have taken place under slightly different scenarios, like if they had pulled different items, as a mental exercise to ensure that they can remain ready for anything similar that may arise in the future. Therefore, it can't be that you're exploiting their overconfidence, because that would be to imply that the mental ground you would gain by being up on them in a match is conscious as opposed to subconscious. They've done absolutely nothing wrong, and will likely continue to do so. Their only crime is being so far ahead of the curve that all of these, what could perhaps be referred to as loopholes, have the potential to develop. So I think that any prospective D1 upsetters could keep all of that in mind. I want to circle back to the underlying nature of the topic of meta stagnation to cap off this video, because this will tie into the next video as well. It's very hard to tangibly define how meta stagnation actually manifests itself within the gameplay of the league per se, as opposed to the league results and statistics, which are much more quantifiable. The primary lens that I saw this unfold through over the course of last year was synonymous with just the same concern that many people have about the function of all tracks as a format when compared to track lists. I know that I did discuss how teams have turned to trying to skill lift people on off-meta picks in episode 3, which you would think would be a confounding factor with reference to this point, but I still think that that can be reconciled with this topic. When it comes to long eras of back-to-back all-track seasons, I have never seen as little experimentation and variety as I did over the course of 2024. It's one thing for the meta to become more defined and for tracks to continue to cement themselves as staples, but I haven't ever seen it quite like this before. And of course, Triton is part of the problem, I'm not denying that, but we've been waiting for the next tracklist season for quite a while such that some kind of cultural reset can take place. Although I'll personally never be able to earnestly support any format besides all tracks, I still do agree with the choice to remove it as an option from the Season 13 track vote, simply because I've witnessed so much of the same over the course of the past 3 seasons. But unfortunately, there's no way for me to prove any of this because the only recent season that there's been any formal data analysis conducted on was Season 11. And because there wasn't that same level of examination conducted with regards to anything else, there's simply nothing for me to tangibly latch onto. But nevertheless, I truly do believe that these past 3 seasons have witnessed barely any worthwhile forward-thinking meta development at the mid to high div level. And I already touched upon the fact that D2 has demonstrated remarkable homogeneity in terms of teams each season, so I guess that means that I've finally run out of things to say in this video. Like I said multiple times, next video will be on some of my thoughts on the Season 11 format vote. If you disagree with absolutely anything I said in this video, then feel free to leave a hate comment and dislike. Otherwise, thank you for watching.